The final delay plugin that we really want to examine is the reverb, and this is a really important thing. It's a component of most modern mixes because it gives us the sense of a space. As we saw earlier, when we're recording, we very often try to isolate an instrument. We create an environment where we've removed all the noise, we've reduced the reflections in the room, and we've recorded that instrument clean and without noise. The problem with that is it becomes sterile. And it sounds like it wasn't recorded in a space because we've removed all that sense of space. But when you go to the final mix, that can sound unnatural. And now we have to add back in the space. It's kind of funny, isn't it? We remove the space and then we bring it back in. But the benefit of this is we can add that same sense of space to all the instruments. And we can really create two different types of mixes if you want to think in broad terms. We can create this sense that all the instruments that you're hearing were recorded together in a similar space, in a single location. And in that case, I would try to use one reverb on my entire mix using that parallel effect signal flow that we discussed earlier in the course. Or we can create a more exotic type of mix. A type of mix that's kind of more like an audio collage, where we're not trying to create a real space that everyone's in, but instead we're just creating a beautiful sonic environment. And in that case, we can use reverb in really creative ways and kind of put things in their own individual locations just to isolate them in the mix. And that's another really good use of reverb. It's another way to guide the listener's focus. It's common to have a reverb that's unique to the vocal, one that's only on that. So that way it is isolated and pulled out and pulled from everything else in the mix. Now, if we are creating a realistic mix, one of the most important parameters we're going to come up with is this dry-wet control. Now, if we put a reverb in a return track in that parallel effect signal flow, we're going to have that reverb be 100% wet, meaning only the reverb signal is coming out of that and coming into that aux track. And the dry signal is controlled by the individual channel strips. But if you're putting a reverb directly on a track, you want to make careful control of that dry-wet, because that dry-wet ends up being kind of a front-to-back control. The wetter a signal is, the further away it seems in the mix, and the drier, the closer to the listener. So like volume, like the high end, it becomes an important element to guide the listener to that one thing you want them to focus on. Now we're going to look at two separate kind of categories of reverb plugins. The first one is an algorithmic reverb, and that creates a reverb from some kind of formula. Kind of like a synthesizer creates sound with a formula. And a convolution reverb, which is actually a recording of a real space applied to the sound that you're currently using in the DAW. Kind of like the sampled instrument. So that idea of synth versus sampler is kind of like algorithmic versus convolution reverb. Let's look at some examples of how reverb plugins function. The final delay plugin we're going to look at is going to be a reverb. And a reverb is a complex plugin built from many of these delay blocks. Instead of adjusting individual delay blocks like we did in the previous delay plugins, we are going to be adjusting parameters designed to represent how delays function in a real space. We have two main kinds of reverb plugin. There'll be an algorithmic reverb, which I have on the left here, or a convolution reverb, which I have on the right. Algorithmic reverbs are kind of like synthesizers in that we're creating the impression of a space with an algorithm of some sort, a mathematical representation. A convolution reverb is like a sampler in that we've recorded the sound of a real space and we're applying that in the DAW. Both are really powerful for different reasons. The convolution reverb is going to sound more like a real space because it actually is a recording of a space. But like a sampler, you're limited in the type of manipulations you can do to it. The algorithmic reverb offers many more opportunities to manipulate the sound of the space, but it also won't sound quite as real because it's not a recording of a real space. We'll start by looking at an algorithmic reverb. And when creating an algorithmic reverb, usually they divide the room up into two separate components, the early reflections and the diffuse reverb. The early reflections are a set of short delays, and if we set this so that we're only hearing the early reverb, it almost sounds like a bunch of those slapback modules that we had set up earlier all working at once. I have a mix set up with all my tracks being routed to the reverb, and I'm soloing the reverb, so all we're hearing is the reverb of the mix. Let's hear this. So this is just the early reflections. If I bypass the plugin, we hear a mix. If I hear the reverb, we're hearing just the early reflections. If I switch over to the diffuse portion of the reverb, so a typical algorithmic reverb will consider those two portions of the sound separate and will give you different controls for the early reflections and the diffuse portion of the reverb. Let's look at the parameters you'll see on the early reflections typically. You'll often have a pre-delay, which delays the entire start of the reverb a little bit. We'll leave that at 10 milliseconds for now. Then we often have some ways to manipulate the algorithm of the space. So we're going to change the location of all those early reflections. Now these parameters will often be called room size or room shape. We'll often have stereo controls. This will depend on how the developer wanted to make the piece of software. But you have a lot of these similar kind of controls in the early reflections section. Let's try to manipulate some and hear the sound change. When I turn up the room size, it does sound like a series of those slapback delays, all at different levels maybe, and different delay times. All right, let's move to the diffuse reverb portion of the algorithmic reverb. The most important thing you're going to find here is going to be reverb time. This is going to be controlling kind of the size of the space you're in. And usually you want to keep it below 2 seconds. A large kind of orchestral hall might have a 2 or 3 second reverb, but most of the music we're going to do is going to be in smaller rooms than that if you're trying to create the sound of a real space. Now for a special effect, a much longer reverb could work, but I think you'll find that a reverb time under 2 seconds is going to be useful in most cases. We can often control the high end in the reverb, which is like changing the materials in the space. Do I have soft curtains in the room, or are they hard walls, which would tend to reflect the high end? So again, all the different parameters in a reverb are really related to this artificial space that we're trying to manipulate. And honestly, using an algorithmic reverb really relies on you knowing the sound of real spaces so that you can emulate them. Usually, you'll get kind of a balance between the early reflections and the diffuse reverb. Let's hear it now. It's not a bad sounding reverb. Let's hear it on the whole mix. I think it's a little too loud. I'll bring it down a bit. So I think that algorithmic reverb worked pretty well for this mix, but I do want to try out a convolution reverb as well and see what we can do with that. With a convolution reverb, most of what you do is choose an impulse response, and an impulse response is the recording of a real space that we're applying with this mathematical procedure called convolution. And in most convolution plugins, you'll find a wide variety of audio files that are representing a large number of real spaces. So largely what you do is choose a space and see if you like it, and then choose another and see if you like it. I've chosen a space that represents a jazz club, and let's hear how it sounds on the mix. Again, I'm going to just solo just the reverb. Let's try a different space. How about a canyon? See, this is the kind of thing you'll find a lot in convolution reverbs. One of the benefits of it is they've taken impulse responses in very exotic spaces. So you can get really strange sound design and really crazy spaces. I think convolution reverbs can be incredibly creative as well as incredibly realistic. Let's try a large hall. Maybe in the context of the mix, it'll sound good. Let's hear it.
Even though it's a big room, it does blend in there quite well. So a huge part of using reverb is really trying to imagine what kind of space would you like to hear this music played in. And then choosing a reverb that works with that. I find a lot of trial and error is really the way to go. Just try things out and see how it fits. One piece of advice is that the reverb ends up being on many elements in your mix. So if you adjust the sound of the reverb, it can adjust the sound of the entire mix. And you may find that using a different reverb can make the mix sound bright, or dull, or empty, or full. It can be really powerful, but whatever you do, be subtle. It doesn't take a lot, and very often what you end up doing is bringing the reverb up till you barely hear it, and then bring it down again. Some of the best settings for reverb are where you don't notice it's there, but when you take it away, it's obvious. And that's a great way to set the level of your reverb.